Haunting of Valentine's Day. James and Emily had been dating for over 2 years. Their relationship started in a casual, innocent way when they met at a university event. They clicked instantly, exchanged numbers, and after a few days of texting, they started dating. As Valentine's Day approached, James was excited to have someone special to spend the day with. Little did he know, things were about to take a terrifying turn. A week before Valentine's Day, Emily confided in James about a disturbing situation she had been dealing with. A man named Mark, a few years older than Emily, had been stalking her for months. They met during a group project at school, and after that, Mark began following her around campus. Emily, trying to brush it off, didn't involve the authorities. She mentioned how Mark started sending creepy texts, and though she ignored them, he persisted. He even managed to find out where she lived, sending gifts and leaving strange messages on her doorstep. The situation escalated when, just before Valentine's Day, Emily received a message from a new phone number asking about her boyfriend. When James saw the message, his unease grew. Now this stranger not only knew about their relationship, but he had also gone as far as using fake numbers to contact her. James assured Emily that he wouldn't let anything happen to her, and together, they agreed they would go to the police if Mark didn't stop. On Valentine's Day, the couple went out to a cozy restaurant by the lake. They enjoyed their meal outside, watching the sunset, when they noticed a man sitting on a bench nearby. He was wearing a hat that seemed to be covering his face, as though he was trying to hide. Emily joked, "What if that's Mark?" They laughed it off, but then the man turned his head slightly in their direction and quickly looked away. After a few minutes, he stood up and walked off. Neither of them was laughing anymore. After dinner, they went back to James's place to spend more time together. Things started to get more intimate when suddenly, Emily pulled away, hearing a strange noise coming from outside. James went to check and found that the stack of beach chairs in the backyard had been knocked over. As he investigated further, he noticed something strange in the bushes, a tall figure standing still, hiding in the shadows. It was Mark. James instinctively charged at him, tackling him to the ground, and yelled for Emily to call the police. Once the police arrived, Emily confirmed that the man was Mark. The officers quickly arrested him for trespassing, and Emily pressed charges for stalking and harassment. Mark was convicted and given a fine, but he also faced a restraining order that would prevent him from contacting Emily again. James and Emily were relieved, but the horror of what had happened lingered long after that night. Months later, as Valentine's Day approached again, Emily and James decided to have a quiet dinner together. As they entered the restaurant, a couple sitting outside stared at them. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Green, and she and her husband claimed to be photographers who thought they made a great couple. They offered to take some photos of the couple at their studio, which was nearby. Though James and Emily were wary, they politely declined and left. However, later that night, they visited a mini golf course, and to their surprise, the same couple showed up. They gave them creepy smiles and kept following them around the course. Emily felt something wasn't right and insisted they leave. Afterward, they went to dinner, but on their way back to James's place, they noticed a car following them. James pulled into a CVS parking lot to get out and check, but the car was gone. On their way home, however, they heard a loud pop. 2 of their tires were flat. James immediately told Emily to get out of the car and run. They hid in the woods while James called the police. After a tense few minutes, the familiar voice of Mrs. Green echoed through the trees. They had been following them, but the police arrived just in time to stop them from doing anything more. The ordeal was terrifying, and even though the couple was never caught, the unsettling feeling stayed with them. They never fully understood why they were being followed or what Mrs. Green's true intentions were. But after that night, Emily and James were even more cautious, always looking over their shoulders, knowing that some shadows can never truly be left behind. After the terrifying events with Mrs. Green and her husband, James and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The tension lingered long after they went back to his house that night, even though they thought they were safe. Their once peaceful lives had now been overshadowed by a constant sense of unease. Days passed, and James kept checking the locks on his doors and windows, while Emily had installed extra security cameras at her apartment. But still, the haunting feeling of being followed didn't go away. Every time they left their house or apartment, they felt eyes on them, watching their every move. A few weeks later, just as they were starting to relax, another strange event occurred. James was at work when Emily received a message on her phone. It was an unknown number, and when she opened it, her heart skipped a beat. It was a photo of her, taken from a distance. The picture showed her walking down the street, looking completely unaware of the camera. The message simply read, "I'm still watching." Emily immediately called James, panic rising in her chest. James rushed home, and they both went through the security footage, but the cameras hadn't captured anyone lurking near their place. Emily was terrified. Had Mark somehow gotten out of jail? Was Mrs. Green somehow involved in this? James, feeling the weight of the situation, took action. He started carrying a self-defense tool when he went out with Emily and began taking different routes home. But even then, the sense of dread never fully lifted. Their once peaceful world was now filled with paranoia, and every shadow seemed to hide something ominous. One evening, about a month after receiving the chilling message, James and Emily decided to stay in. They were sitting on the couch, watching a movie, when there was a sudden knock at the door. Both of them froze, the sound reverberating through the house, their hearts racing. James cautiously stood up and peeked through the peephole. No one was there. He opened the door slowly, scanning the area, but there was no sign of anyone. Just as he was about to close the door, he noticed something on the ground, a small, neatly wrapped package. He bent down to pick it up and found a card with the same handwriting as the previous messages. The words inside were chilling. "You can't escape me. I'll always be watching." James's blood ran cold. They weren't just dealing with someone who wanted to scare them, they were dealing with a person who was obsessed, determined to break through their walls and make them feel like prisoners in their own lives. Emily was now visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she sat next to James. She felt completely violated, knowing that no matter how much they tried to protect themselves, there was always the threat of someone who was watching, lurking in the background. That night, they both barely slept. They stayed awake, listening for every creak and groan in the house. Every noise seemed to make the darkness more oppressive, as though it held secrets they couldn't unravel. The next day, James decided they couldn't keep living in fear. They went to the police once more, showing them the package and the new message. This time, the authorities took the threat more seriously. After taking a report and reviewing the footage from the security cameras, they promised to step up the investigation. But deep down, James and Emily knew that the feeling of being hunted would not simply vanish with the filing of a report. Then, the unthinkable happened. One morning, as James was leaving for work, he noticed something strange on his car. The windshield was covered with a note that read, "You think you can get away? I'll be there on Valentine's Day." The message was unmistakable. It was from someone who had been following them all along. The chilling reference to Valentine's Day seemed to imply that the person would strike again on the same night they first met. The terror from that evening months ago seemed to resurface, bringing with it a new wave of anxiety and fear. With time running out, James and Emily decided to make one final stand. They reached out to a close group of friends for support, asking them to be extra vigilant and to stay with them during the days leading up to Valentine's Day. They knew they couldn't take any more chances. Valentine's Day came again, but this time, Emily and James weren't going to let the fear consume them. They had a backup plan, ready to call the police, armed with their phones, and prepared for the worst. They spent the evening together, in the safety of their home, with friends by their side. As the hours passed, they kept looking at the door, windows, and every shadow, but nothing happened. The night wore on, and when midnight passed, they realized that the man, whoever he was, had not shown up. The creeping feeling of dread that had haunted them for so long slowly began to lift. The police continued their investigation, but Mark was never found, and the mysterious couple, Mrs. Green and her husband, seemed to disappear as well. The stalker's obsession finally seemed to fade. James and Emily never fully understood why they were targeted or why the couple followed them so obsessively. But they knew one thing for sure: they had learned to be more cautious and aware of their surroundings, realizing that sometimes, no matter how hard you try to protect yourself, you can never fully escape the shadows of your past. Though the days following Valentine's Day had passed without incident, the tension never fully lifted. James and Emily tried to return to normal life, but every unexpected noise or unfamiliar person seemed to send their hearts racing. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. Several months went by, and the couple had begun to believe that perhaps the worst was finally behind them. They were no longer as cautious as they had been before, and the security cameras were almost an afterthought. Emily returned to work, and James went back to his usual routine. But deep down, they both knew they couldn't fully escape the fear that had once consumed them. Then, one quiet evening in late summer, the nightmare returned. James had just finished a long day at work and was excited to unwind with Emily. As he walked into their apartment, he noticed that something felt off. The air was still, the lights were on, and yet, the atmosphere was strangely tense. His instincts kicked in. He immediately checked the locks, the windows, and the security cameras. Everything seemed in place, but something wasn't right. Emily came out of the kitchen, looking pale and shaken. "James, I need to talk to you. I don't know how to say this, but something happened today." James felt his heart sink. "What happened?" Emily's voice trembled as she explained. She had gone out to run errands earlier that afternoon. While walking back to her car, she noticed a man standing in the parking lot, staring at her from across the street. The moment their eyes met, he quickly turned and walked away. It was brief, but it sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was someone familiar. That night, Emily had trouble sleeping. Every noise outside, every shadow in the corner of her room, made her hyper-aware. James held her close, promising that everything would be fine. But deep inside, they both knew that they were once again living in fear. The next morning, when Emily went outside to check her car, she noticed something strange. A small note had been left on the windshield, carefully folded. With trembling hands, she unfolded it, and her heart nearly stopped. It read, "I've been waiting. It's not over. I know where you are." James felt the terror creeping up his spine as he read the note over her shoulder. It was too familiar. The writing. The threats. Everything. It was like a continuation of the nightmare they thought was over. Immediately, they contacted the police, but after taking another report and reviewing the footage from their cameras, the officers couldn't find anything to connect this new incident to Mark or anyone else they knew. It was as if the man had appeared out of nowhere, and once again, the couple felt powerless. Over the next few days, the fear began to consume them. Every time Emily stepped outside, she felt like someone was watching her. Every unfamiliar face in the crowd felt like a potential threat. Every car that passed their house seemed to have someone inside who was interested in them. They couldn't shake the paranoia. But one night, after weeks of unease, things took a darker turn. It was a late evening when James and Emily were sitting on the couch, watching a movie. The wind howled outside, and the trees outside their window swayed in the breeze. It was a stormy night, the kind of night where you feel like anything could happen. As the movie played on, they heard a soft tapping on the window. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. Emily's eyes widened with fear as she looked at James, who immediately stood up and walked toward the window. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the curtains. "Stay here," he whispered to Emily. With a quick motion, James pulled the curtains aside, his heart pounding in his chest. There, standing outside in the pouring rain, was a figure. The silhouette was unmistakable. It was the same man they had seen months ago. He was standing at the edge of their yard, staring at the window with an eerie calmness, as though he had been waiting for them to notice. Before James could react, the man took a few steps back, disappearing into the darkness. But the feeling of dread was overwhelming. It was as if the shadows were closing in around them once again. James immediately called the police, and within minutes, officers arrived at their home. They scoured the yard, but there was no sign of the man. The storm had washed away any potential evidence, and the officers were left with little to go on. However, they assured James and Emily that they would increase patrols in the area, but the couple couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. Over the next few weeks, Emily and James made the difficult decision to leave the apartment they had called home. The memories of being stalked, the sense of constant fear, had made it impossible for them to continue living there. They moved to a different part of the city, hoping for a fresh start. But even in their new home, the paranoia remained. Every knock on the door, every car that slowed down near their house, sent them into a panic. They had changed their phone numbers, set up new security systems, and taken every precaution they could think of, but the feeling of being hunted never left. And as the months went by, Emily and James realized that the shadows from their past would never fully fade. They had survived the nightmare, but they would forever be looking over their shoulders, knowing that sometimes, the darkest of threats linger in the places we can't see.